In a courtroom built for facts and evidence, no one expected the key witness to be a silent 3-year-old boy, or that his voice would come through a dog. Leo never spoke to people, only to Shadow, the therapy dog by his side. But everything changed the moment he whispered, "He's the bad one." That quiet sentence shattered expectations and exposed a truth no one saw coming. As his whispers turned into drawings and memories, a shocking secret emerged, one that would turn the entire case upside down. Who really hurt his mother? And why was the man defending the accused starting to fall apart? Stay with us to witness how trust, silence, and the bond between a child and a dog uncovered a truth louder than any testimony. Leo clung tightly to his foster mother's hand, his small fingers digging into her skin as though she were the last piece of ground he could stand on. In his other arm he held a stuffed rabbit so worn its seams had turned to soft frays. Shadow padded quietly at his side, not pulling on the leash, not hurrying, simply walking as if he already knew his job. The bailiff moved ahead to clear a path through the corridor of lawyers and onlookers, but Leo didn't lift his head. He watched only the floor tiles passing under his sneakers, counting them as if they were stepping stones across a river. Behind them came Rachel Torres, the prosecutor, her case files tucked under her arm but her eyes fixed on the boy. She had prepared for weeks to argue evidence and legal points, but none of that mattered if Leo could not be reached. He had not spoken to a single adult since the night his mother was carried away on a stretcher. Even the child psychologist had warned Rachel that pressing him too hard might make him withdraw completely. Yet here he was, in a room built for adult confrontations, the weight of the city's eyes on his small shoulders. Rachel kept her distance at first, letting Leo's foster mother guide him toward the front. The defense table rustled as Gregory Elmore leaned over to whisper to his co-counsel, his silver hair glinting under the overhead lights. He didn't glance at Leo at first, too busy smirking at the gallery of reporters. "This is absurd," he muttered, just loudly enough for the nearest juror to hear. "A toddler? This is what they're hanging their case on?" His associate nodded nervously, already flipping through papers. On the opposite side, Rachel bent slightly, pretending to shuffle documents but actually watching Leo's movements, the way his eyes darted not to faces but to Shadow's back. The dog's tail twitched once, almost imperceptibly, a signal of focus he'd been trained to give. Leo didn't speak, but he pressed his cheek briefly against Shadow's shoulder as they reached the witness area. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Holloway, glanced down at the file before her, then at the boy. She didn't call for the oath. She simply said, "Take your time, young man." Her voice was softer than anyone had heard from her in years, but still it drew no response. The foster mother crouched and murmured, "It's okay. Leo, Shadow's here." She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before stepping aside. The boy's knees bent slightly as if he wanted to sit but wasn't sure where. Shadow settled near the witness chair, lowering himself so Leo could lean if he needed to. Rachel exchanged a look with Dr. Aaron Fields, the trauma specialist seated behind her. His raised eyebrows seemed to ask, "Do we even try?" Rachel tilted her head toward the boy, silently answering, "We wait." At the defense table, Elmore smirked again, taking out a pen and clicking it with a little flourish. "Your Honor, may we dispense with theatrics?" he asked, voice dripping with false courtesy. "If the child can't speak, we're wasting the court's time." Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. "You'll wait," she said simply. Elmore sat back, irritated but silent. Meanwhile, Leo's fingers dug into the rabbit's ear, twisting it until the fabric bunched. He turned his head slightly toward Shadow, lips moving but no sound reaching the adults. Rachel felt her chest tighten. She had seen children frozen before, eyes glassy, lips clamped shut, and knew forcing speech rarely worked. But she had also seen what Shadow could do. The canine officer had been introduced during therapy sessions only weeks earlier, and Leo had gravitated to him instantly. Dr. Fields had explained it. Children who can't speak trauma allowed sometimes speak it sideways, to animals, to toys, to drawings. It wasn't a strategy. It was survival. Shadow shifted closer now, his shoulder brushing Leo's knee. The boy blinked rapidly, his fingers pausing on the rabbit's ear. He whispered again, inaudible. Rachel's instinct was to ask, "What is he saying?" but she bit her tongue. This had to be his moment, not hers. The gallery had grown so still that even Elmore's associate stopped writing. Leo's head tilted, his forehead resting against Shadow's fur. His lips moved again, more firmly this time, and the dog's ears flicked forward. No one heard the words at first, only saw the boy's mouth form them. The foster mother started to step forward, but Judge Holloway raised a hand, holding her back. Rachel leaned forward, heart pounding. Then Leo's voice, small but clear, lifted just enough to reach the first row of the jury. "He's the bad one. 4 words, no tremor, no uncertainty. He didn't point, he didn't cry. He just lifted his head and stared straight at Gregory Elmore. The defense attorney's pen froze mid-click. His jaw twitched as if he'd been slapped. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, reporters jerking up their pens. One juror's hand went to her mouth. Rachel forced herself to stay still, to let the weight of the words hang in the air. She knew if she rushed forward now it would look staged, but nothing about this was staged. Leo's eyes stayed fixed on Elmore, his small body leaning slightly toward Shadow as though drawing strength from the dog's steady presence. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel once, not in reprimand but to anchor the room. "The court will come to order," she said, though her own voice sounded almost hushed. Elmore straightened in his chair, color rising in his face. "Objection," he barked, but the word landed flat as though even he knew it wouldn't erase what had just happened. "Sustained," the judge said automatically, but no one moved. The jury had seen the boy's face, heard the unfiltered truth in his tone. Rachel's throat felt dry. She reached for a glass of water but didn't drink. Across the aisle, Dr. Fields exhaled slowly. The foster mother clasped her hands together, eyes glistening. Leo, meanwhile, had already dropped his gaze back to Shadow, his hands sliding into the dog's fur. For him, the moment had passed. For everyone else, it had just begun. And as the courtroom trembled under the quiet power of a child's voice, Rachel knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. After that whisper, those 4 small words spoken with unsettling clarity, Rachel Torres knew the courtroom had shifted, but the greater weight settled on what came after. She didn't press Leo for more. In fact, she avoided direct contact with him for the rest of the day. Instead, she asked Dr. Fields to observe, to listen, to note what changed, and something did. At that afternoon, when Leo returned to the small waiting room designated for child witnesses, he pulled out a box of crayons from his backpack. Not the kind with 64 colors and a sharpener, but a simple set, worn and broken, some labels peeled off. He didn't speak, didn't look up, but he began to draw. At first it was chaotic, lines on lines, color overlapping in a kind of storm. But then the shapes began to form. A rectangular shape cracked down the middle, a figure with oversized arms, jagged and shaded in harsh red. Another figure small and curled under a flat surface. Shadow sat beside him the whole time, head resting near Leo's hand, as if watching the drawing become more than art, watching it become a memory pushed out of silence. Rachel didn't see the drawing until later that evening. Dr. Fields handed it to her in the hallway with a slow, deliberate motion, like he was giving her a confession. He didn't say a word, the therapist said, but he gave this to Shadow. Rachel studied the page, her pulse tightening. She had seen crime scene photos that mirrored this almost exactly. A splintered table leg, blood pooling under the kitchen tile, furniture knocked off balance. But Leo's sketch wasn't a reproduction. It was emotionally coded. The hands of the attacker were massive, disproportionate, filled with thick, violent scribbles. The child under the table was nothing more than a half circle and 2 dots for eyes, wide and black. Rachel took a breath. "He remembers," she said. "Not just the facts, the fear." She placed the drawing in her case file, but it felt like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere more sacred. This wasn't something coaxed or manipulated. No adult had let him. This was Leo speaking in the only language he trusted, and that language had a name: Shadow. Over the next 2 days, the routine became strangely consistent. Leo would come into the courthouse, always holding his stuffed rabbit in one hand and Shadow's leash in the other. He still didn't speak to the attorneys or the therapist, but he drew. Always sitting cross-legged on the same rug in the child witness room, always beside Shadow. Sometimes the drawings were chaotic, as if he was trying to push something out of himself too fast. Other times they were focused, lines clean, images clearer. There was one where a stick figure stood by a door, arms raised as another figure lay on the floor. Another where a chair was turned over, and next to it, a series of what looked like shoes, adult-sized, drawn in black. Rachel had each drawing scanned, dated, and logged. Elmore's team scoffed, of course. "Are we really admitting doodles into evidence now?" one of his assistants sneered. But Rachel didn't care. She wasn't collecting proof in the conventional sense. She was following threads, thin, trembling threads that Leo kept handing her in secret, through colors, shapes, and silence. It was a breadcrumb trail from a child's memory, and Shadow was the compass. What struck Rachel most wasn't the content of the drawings, though those alone would shake even the most hardened juror. It was how Leo treated Shadow through it all. He didn't talk to him like a pet. He didn't give commands. He leaned into him like a confidant. Sometimes he would whisper things, half-formed sentences, emotional syllables, Once Rachel overheard him murmur, "You saw, right?" while holding up a page with a figure lying beneath the table. Another time he whispered, "You weren't there, but now you are." Each phrase was a thread, not just to the night of the incident, but to Leo's experience of it, his isolation, his confusion, his need to make someone else remember with him because remembering alone at that age was too much. Rachel began to realize that Shadow was doing more than comforting him. He was translating something that no adult had been able to access. The trauma had fractured Leo's language, but through the quiet bond with the dog, meaning began to return, piece by delicate piece. In a private meeting, Rachel sat down with Dr. Fields and reviewed the drawings again, this time laying them out in order of content and tone. "It's like he's building a timeline," Rachel noted, "but it's emotional, not logical. First he shows the fear, then he shows the moment, then something after." Fields nodded. "Most trauma in children isn't linear. He's not telling a story from beginning to end. He's dropping pieces of it as he's able. That's why Shadow is vital. The boy doesn't feel interrogated when he's with him. He feels heard without having to explain." Rachel tapped a drawing, the one with the black shoes. These matched the footprint photos taken from the crime scene. No way he could have seen those pictures. "This," she paused, heart pounding, "this is real." Fields leaned back. "The question is, will the court see it that way?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She stared at the coloring in silence. She knew what she was holding wasn't admissible in the traditional sense, but it was truth. And sometimes truth didn't come in sworn statements. Sometimes it came in the shape of a crayon line traced by a child's trembling hand. Each whisper, each crayon stroke told Rachel something louder than any witness testimony she'd ever heard. Leo wasn't trying to convince anyone. He wasn't performing. He was remembering, safely, quietly, because Shadow was there to catch the weight of it. The defense team could roll their eyes, but Rachel saw what they didn't. This was the slow, painful unfolding of trauma, not as spectacle, but as survival. Every morning, Leo handed Shadow a new drawing. He never gave them to Rachel, never to the court officer, never even to Dr. Fields. Only Shadow. And that, Rachel realized, was the most powerful form of trust they had. He wasn't speaking to the court. He was speaking to the one being who always listened. Leo's silence wasn't empty, it was purposeful. That's what Dr. Aaron Fields kept repeating to Rachel Torres as he set up the small speaker on the table in the courthouse consultation room. "He doesn't talk to us," the therapist said quietly, "but he talks to Shadow. And it's not nonsense. It's structured. He's recalling." Rachel, arms crossed and jaw tense, didn't respond right away. She had spent the past few days watching the boy deliver more clarity through scribbled drawings than some adults gave under oath. But still, she needed to hear it. Something direct. Something unfiltered. Dr. Fields pressed play. Static cracked briefly before a soft rustle and a young voice filled the room. "Leo, Shadow," he yelled. The recording played. A pause. "Mommy cried. I was under the table." The words were small, almost delicate, but they landed hard. Rachel froze, the hair on her arms rising. She replayed the sentence in her head. Not just a memory, a location, a sequence, an emotional imprint. He yelled. "Mommy cried. I was under the table." She looked at Fields. "This was last week?" He nodded. He wasn't asked. He just started talking to the dog. Rachel blinked hard. This wasn't mimicry. This was trauma coming back into language, one whisper at a time. Dr. Fields took a breath and added, "There's more. Bits and pieces." He cued the next part of the recording, skipping ahead a few seconds. "The lamp broke," Leo said faintly. "It made the loudest sound. I covered my ears." Rachel closed her eyes as she listened. "Then I saw ... shoes. They were big. Black. I was under the table and I saw them." She opened her eyes, locking onto Fields. "This matches what forensics documented," she said. "We found broken glass across the floor and lamp fragments in the kitchen. The table was snapped near the base. And the shoes, we photographed adult footprints near the scene." Fields nodded. "He didn't see those photos, Rachel. He couldn't have. I haven't shown him anything from the case. He draws and speaks only from memory, always when Shadow's present." Rachel ran a hand through her hair. "He's not giving testimony," she murmured. He's reliving it," Fields agreed. "Exactly, but only in fragments. And only through Shadow. He doesn't trust adults, not even me, but the dog. That's his witness stand. That's where he tells his truth." Rachel tapped the edge of the table, heart pounding. Every part of her training said recordings like this weren't enough, but everything in her gut told her they were holding something precious. Real evidence. emotional evidence hiding in a child's whispers. That afternoon, Rachel requested a private review with the judge. She knew it was unorthodox, but she also knew Judge Holloway respected the nuance of trauma. "I'm not asking for this to be played in open court," Rachel clarified. "Not yet. I just want you to hear what I heard." The judge listened in silence, her expression unreadable as Leo's voice flowed through the small speaker. "Shadow. I was scared. Mommy said run, but I couldn't. I hid." A long pause followed. Then Leo added, "He had a red tie." That detail hit like a punch. Rachel leaned in. "The night of the incident," she said carefully, "Gregory Elmore wore a red tie. It's in the police report, noted by the responding officers." The judge looked up sharply. "Does he still wear one?" Rachel nodded. "Almost every day in court. Leo's never been prompted on this. Never shown photos." Judge Holloway sat back. "I want this transcript reviewed by the court psychologist, but I won't dismiss it. Not yet." That was all Rachel needed. A crack in the door, an opening. She turned to Fields after the judge left and whispered, "This might be enough to submit as corroborative support." He nodded, but added quietly, "The dog is still the key. Don't forget that. Without Shadow, none of this exists." Over the next 2 days, Rachel observed more sessions. Sometimes Leo would say nothing at all, just sit beside Shadow, fingers tangled in the dog's fur, lost in his own head. Other times he'd speak in bursts, as if a switch had flipped. "He came in mad," Leo whispered once, nose pressed to Shadow's neck. "He said bad words. Mommy told him to go away. He pushed her." Rachel, seated behind the one-way glass, took detailed notes while Fields recorded. In another session, Leo murmured, "I wanted to be loud, but I was scared." "Shadow, you bark louder than me. You would have scared him away." Rachel had to look away, blinking back something that wasn't quite tears, but wasn't far from them either. It wasn't just about the crime anymore. It was about the isolation of a child who felt invisible, powerless to protect the person he loved most. And now, with Shadow at his side, he was rewinding the tape in his mind, not to suffer, but to finally let someone see. Rachel had built cases with evidence bags, testimonies, and security footage. But this was the first time she felt she was building a case through the language of silence. The defense tried to downplay the sessions when they caught wind of them. "You're letting a toddler dictate legal direction by whispering to a dog," Elmore mocked in court sidebar. "What's next? Puppet theater?" Rachel didn't flinch. "He's given consistent, uncoached details that align with crime scene evidence. Details that were never made public," she replied coolly. "He identified the red tie. He described the broken lamp, the angle of the overturned chair. You want to call that coincidence?" Elmore scoffed, but there was less certainty in his voice than before. Judge Holloway leaned in. "We're entering complex territory," she said, "but the court is obliged to examine all meaningful material. That includes child witness behavior, however unconventional." Outside court, Rachel asked Fields to prepare a full psychological review of Leo's trauma expression pattern, emphasizing the consistency of what he disclosed in therapy. They both understood it wouldn't be enough on its own, but it wasn't meant to be. It was a thread, a tale, a truth that when pulled gently might unravel the rest of the story Leo carried locked inside. Rachel pressed her hand against Shadow's head after one session and whispered, "Keep listening, buddy. He needs you more than any of us." Rachel knew now beyond doubt that this wasn't guesswork. It wasn't creative play or coached repetition. It was memory, real, vivid, painful memory being offloaded in the only way Leo trusted. The courtroom continued to struggle with how to handle it. The defense pushed to disqualify any mention of therapy recordings, citing hearsay and emotional manipulation. But Rachel had the transcripts, the timestamps, and most of all, the consistency. Over and over, Leo offered the same fragments: the yell, the lamp, the red tie, the sound of the door slamming. The pieces were forming a map, and though they came softly, hesitantly, they came with weight. Leo had no words for trauma in the courtroom, no sentences for the fear he carried. But he had Shadow, and with him, Leo remembered everything. When Leo was brought to the stand again, the court seemed to hold its collective breath, not out of expectation but uncertainty. There were no promises that he would speak, and Rachel Torres had made it clear she wouldn't push him. Instead, she had arranged for Shadow to sit beside the boy and placed a small pack of crayons and paper on the ledge in front of him. As he was gently lifted into the chair, Leo clutched the dog's ear and held it close to his cheek for a moment. Then Rachel, careful not to crowd him, crouched beside the stand and said quietly, "Leo... Would you like to draw something for Shadow today?" She didn't ask him to draw the house. She didn't mention his mother. She didn't say the word crime. She just said shadow. That name, the one place where Leo's trust lived. The boy blinked once, looked at the crayons, and then reached forward without a word. The room stayed silent as he picked a single red crayon, then black, and began to draw with methodical slowness. His brows drawn together in the kind of focus no child his age should ever have to wear. Rachel watched with growing intensity as the picture took shape. She wasn't the only one. One by one, members of the jury leaned forward slightly, as if the gravity of the moment was pulling them in. At first it looked like childlike scribbles, vague shapes, broken lines. But then came definition. A rectangular shape cracked in two like something snapped. A stick figure beneath it curled tight into a ball smaller than the others on the page. Another figure loomed nearby, tall, jagged, almost scribbled in anger. And around the hands, the most unexpected detail were thick red circles, uneven and rushed. Rachel's breath caught. Her hand moved to her mouth. The red crayon didn't just represent color, it was intent, blood, violence. She recognized it immediately, and more importantly, so did the lead detective sitting behind her. The detective leaned forward and whispered, "That's the table, and the hands. Jesus, those are the bruises we documented." The image matched the position of the mother's body when she was found, collapsed beside the broken table, her arms raised in defense. No child could fake this. No child could invent a memory so raw. Rachel stood slowly, her hands trembling as she reached out. "Leo," she said gently, "can I give this to the judge? Just to show her what Shadow sees?" Leo looked at her, uncertain, then at Shadow. The dog made a soft whine as if encouraging him. Leo nodded once and slid the paper toward her. Rachel walked it across the courtroom like it was a sacred thing, a fragile truth drawn in wax. As she placed the picture in front of the judge, her voice faltered. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this into evidence. It was not solicited. The child wasn't coached. But it aligns in alarming accuracy with the physical evidence found at the scene." Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses and studied the page with care. "Admitted," she said quietly, and stamped the submission, but the moment didn't end there. The defense stirred, clearly unnerved. Elmore whispered sharply to his assistant, eyes locked on the drawing. Rachel could see the confidence slipping. This wasn't a stunt. This was a child testifying without ever speaking a word. A child whose memories had been trapped inside fear and who, thanks to a dog and a box of crayons, was finally being heard. The jury's demeanor shifted, no one relaxed. Instead, they leaned in, eyes narrowed, not in skepticism but focus. One juror, a retired teacher, scribbled fiercely on her notepad. Another, an older man who'd previously looked disinterested, now sat upright with his arms folded tightly across his chest. It was as though Leo's drawing had sliced through their adult frameworks of logic and gone straight for something deeper. Empathy. Rachel turned slightly to look at the defense team. Elmore was tapping his pen against the table too quickly. His jaw was locked. For the first time since the trial began, he didn't look smug. He looked afraid. "They won't let a picture decide the case," his co-counsel whispered to him. But even she didn't sound convinced. Because they all knew this picture wasn't just a drawing. It was a confession in color. It was a timeline. It was proof. More than that, it was a memory, delivered in the only language a traumatized child trusted. Dr. Fields, seated near Rachel, whispered, "I have never seen him communicate this much in one session. Not with anyone." Rachel nodded, still stunned by the detail of the red scribbles. "It's not just the drawing, it's the precision," she murmured. "The broken table, the position of the figures. And those hands. He remembers the color of the pain." They both knew how rare this was. Most children Leo's age wouldn't have had the cognitive or emotional capacity to construct a visual memory this detailed. But trauma rewires things. It distills moments into fragments, symbols, associations. Leo didn't need words. His story had been locked in the body, in the memory of hiding, in the way his hands shook when he held a crayon. And now, in the most public and terrifying setting possible, he'd released it, not because someone asked him to, but because he felt safe enough with Shadow to let it out. That safety, Rachel realized, was more powerful than any cross-examination, more truthful than any adult recollection. Leo was not recounting events. He was reliving them, transforming them, and finally giving them shape. The moment closed as quietly as it had begun. The judge signaled a recess. Rachel exhaled shakily and returned to her seat, the drawing still fresh in her mind. As Leo was gently lifted off the witness stand by the court child advocate, he clutched Shadow's collar, resting his face briefly against the dog's fur. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What he had put on paper spoke louder than any testimony ever could. The courtroom had never seen anything like it, a child testifying through color and silence with a dog by his side. The defense grew uneasy, and the jury leaned closer. When the court reconvened that morning, no one expected the storm that was about to hit. Leo sat quietly beside Shadow, clutching the dog's fur in one hand and a small drawing in the other. His foster mother adjusted his collar while Rachel stood nearby, silently preparing herself for another difficult but necessary step. They weren't sure if Leo would respond again, but they had to try. The judge gave a soft nod, and Rachel approached the boy with the kind of gentleness that had become her signature in this case. "Leo," she said softly, kneeling to his level, "do you remember who hurt your mommy?" For a second, the room held its breath. Then, with a clarity that made the air feel heavier, Leo raised his arm and pointed not at Martin Gates, the accused, but at someone no one had even considered, Gregory Elmore, the defense attorney. The courtroom instantly erupted. Chaos unfurled like wildfire. Gasps shot through the crowd. Reporters scrambled, pens moving, cameras clicking. Elmore's expression faltered just slightly, but enough. "Objection," he snapped, standing quickly, his voice strained. The judge banged her gavel, but the noise had already detonated something larger than courtroom protocol. Rachel stood frozen for a second, her breath caught in her throat. Then she turned slowly to face Elmore, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. The man who had confidently defended Martin was now at the center of a new narrative. The judge called for immediate order, reminding the court that Leo's statement was not yet evidence. But it didn't matter. Something had shifted. The energy had changed. The jury, who had spent days passively observing, were now leaning forward. Elmore's flawless demeanor had cracked under the weight of a child's unwavering finger. Elmore's reaction became the first real clue. His palms, once resting calmly on the table, now fidgeted with the edge of his notes. His tie, that perfect crimson silk knot, was being loosened with shaking hands. Rachel's instincts kicked in like a spark hitting dry wood. "Your Honor," she said firmly, voice rising above the commotion, "we request a recess to investigate this new development." The judge hesitated, torn between the sanctity of the proceedings and the magnitude of what had just unfolded. With a tense pause, she finally nodded. "This court is in recess," she declared, her voice low, conflicted. In the crowd, Leo sat motionless, unaware of the explosion he had just caused. But Shadow leaned into him, sensing the change, as always. Leo didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The courtroom had heard everything it needed. Behind closed doors, Rachel moved fast. She met with Detective Brooks in a narrow hallway just outside the courtroom. "Run everything on Elmore," she ordered. "Phone records, bank accounts, travel logs. I want to know where he was that night, down to the minute." Brooks didn't ask questions. He nodded and got to work. Rachel's mind raced. Could it be that Elmore wasn't just defending a monster, but was the monster? If Leo was right, and the evidence aligned, it would mean the legal system had been compromised at the very core. Her blood ran cold at the thought. She didn't care how high Elmore's connections went. She would chase the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. Across the hall, Elmore sat alone, staring at the door as if expecting it to swing open with the weight of judgment. For the first time in his career, the man who had manipulated truths now feared their full arrival. The investigation moved quickly. Within hours, inconsistencies emerged. Elmore's alibi didn't hold. The shell company connected to his firm had ties to Martin Gates, and recent financial transfers raised more than just eyebrows. The most damning detail came from cell tower pings, placing Elmore near the victim's residence on the night of the attack. Rachel reviewed the documents with a numb kind of focus. It wasn't enough yet, but it was close. Dangerously close. Back inside the courtroom, Rachel walked past Elmore and noticed the tremor in his jaw, the way he avoided her eyes. Leo had seen something, remembered something real. The courtroom hadn't believed it at first. But now the truth, once buried beneath layers of legal armor and manipulation, was surfacing, brought forward not by evidence alone, but by the unwavering purity of a child's memory. When the court came back into session, the atmosphere was no longer neutral. Every eye was on Elmore. Rachel stood, calm but fierce, and the judge addressed the room. "We have received new information that may significantly alter the course of this trial." Elmore tried to protest, but his voice cracked, and then Leo, still by Shadow's side, looked up again. This time he said nothing. He didn't have to. The simple gesture of that small finger pointing in quiet certainty had already done more than volumes of testimony ever could. It had shattered lies, pierced reputations, and set justice back on its rightful path. The courtroom had been flipped upside down, not by argument or force, but by the undeniable clarity of a child's truth. And so the boy who had once refused to speak had just changed everything. The judge's gavel hit the desk harder than usual as she called for an emergency recess. No one asked why. The courtroom had already shifted into a state of quiet chaos, an undercurrent of tension rippling beneath each face as murmurs spread. Judge Holloway's expression was unreadable, but her eyes briefly met Rachel Torres's, and it was enough, a silent directive to act fast. Within minutes, Rachel had stormed out of the courtroom, trailed closely by Detective Brooks, her laptop in hand, phone already ringing. "I want everything we have on Elmore's financials," she snapped into the receiver. "Search any shared accounts, transfers, even dormant ones. Cross-check them with Gates." Brooks didn't need instructions. He was already unlocking his tablet, pulling up cell tower pings and subpoena data they hadn't bothered reviewing before. Not because it lacked importance, but because no one had even imagined the defense attorney could be the perpetrator. But Leo had imagined it, or rather remembered it. He hadn't spoken names or offered adult vocabulary, just the shape of a tie, the color of anger, the smell of fear. And that was enough to force open a door none of them had realized was there. The data didn't shout the truth, it whispered it, like Leo had. Rachel and Brooks began seeing the puzzle not as a violent moment in isolation, but as the last link in a chain built quietly over months. Bank transfers from an account tied to Martin Gates were traced to a consulting firm with no website, no employees, and only one recurring contractor, Gregory Elmore. The payments were irregular but consistent enough to suggest intent. Brooks muttered, flipping through the records. "You see this timing? Every deposit hits 2 days after each failed negotiation between Martin and the victim's lawyer." Rachel's stomach tightened. The motive was never rage, it was control. The goal wasn't chaos, it was silence. Elmore wasn't just defending the man accused of the crime. He had been part of planning it, maybe even the one who took it further than planned. He didn't just cover for Gates, Rachel said slowly. He executed the plan himself. That night, they reviewed security footage from traffic cameras 2 blocks from the victim's apartment. At 11:38 p.m., Elmore's car passed, time-stamped, undeniable. He had claimed to be at home alone, but Leo had remembered the red tie, and now the trail was lit. Back in the courtroom's waiting room, Leo sat curled beside Shadow, crayon in hand but not drawing, just holding it. A court counselor asked softly, "Leo, are you okay? Are you scared?" The boy didn't answer at first. He looked at Shadow, then leaned down until his nose touched the dog's neck. "Shadow's not scared," he said. "So I'm not either," the counselor blinked, taken aback. Not by the logic, but by the conviction. The statement wasn't brave in the performative sense. It was steady, assured. It wasn't a child pretending not to be afraid, it was a child choosing not to be, because the one being he trusted most didn't flinch. Shadow stayed curled around Leo like a fortress, silent, loyal, grounding. Word of Leo's calm response made its way back to the judge, who sat in her chambers reviewing the chain of evidence Rachel had just delivered. The more she read, the more it became clear. This wasn't a courtroom trick. This wasn't a show. The child's truth had never come through spectacle. It had come through instinct, memory, and above all, trust. Not in adults, but in a dog. In Shadow. Elmore returned to the courtroom, unaware of how much had shifted during recess. His usual confidence was thinner now, but he still held the air of someone used to controlling rooms. That illusion didn't last. The moment Rachel stood to file the preliminary motion to investigate Elmore's involvement based on new evidence, the tension cracked. Elmore's eyes darted to the documents being handed to the judge. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he started, but was cut off. "You will not speak," Judge Holloway said firmly. "Not until I review what's been submitted." His co-counsel leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but his composure was already crumbling. Rachel watched closely. No yelling. No dramatic accusations. Just steady, methodical collapse. The kind of collapse that doesn't need words. Because when the evidence is real, it doesn't need volume. It only needs clarity. Rachel turned to Leo, still seated quietly in the viewing area, Shadow at his feet. She didn't wave. Didn't draw attention. But he looked at her. And she nodded once, slow, quiet, full of something that felt like reverence. He had trusted Shadow. Shadow had trusted her. And now the truth had begun to walk into the light. Rachel took a breath and addressed the court. "We believe the defense counsel, Gregory Elmore, acted beyond his legal role and engaged directly in the assault of the victim. At the direction and with financial compensation from Martin Gates." Murmurs broke out immediately. Elmore's face went pale. "We have transactional records, geolocation data, and surveillance footage placing him near the victim's residence on the night of the attack." Rachel's voice didn't waver. "We are not just dealing with obstruction of justice. We're dealing with participation in an attempted murder. The judge, now visibly grim, called for Elmore to be remanded and removed from court until further review. As two officers approached Elmore, he stepped back, then froze, as if realizing that resistance would only confirm everything the boy had already pointed to. In the chaos that followed, the room spun with motions, objections, and court whispers. But in the far corner, Leo remained steady, because Shadow was steady. Because for the first time in weeks, adults weren't arguing over what was real. They were finally following it. When questioned again if he was scared, Leo simply replied, "Shadow isn't scared, so I'm not either." In that moment, even the judge began to see this wasn't theatrics, it was truth finding a way to speak. Leo's return to court wasn't planned. No one summoned him. There was no court order, no strategy session behind closed doors. He came because he wanted to. That alone sent a current through the courthouse. Rachel didn't know what to expect when she saw him enter the side room with Shadow at his side and a small zipped pouch clutched in his hand. He was holding it tightly, almost protectively, like something inside it mattered more than he knew how to say. His foster mother crouched beside him, whispering something Rachel couldn't hear, but Leo didn't respond. Instead, he walked straight toward the table where Rachel and Dr. Fields sat reviewing the previous day's evidence. He didn't speak, didn't explain. He simply unzipped the pouch, reached in, and placed two new drawings on the table. Rachel froze. One drawing was unmistakable. It was Elmore, drawn with harsh, jagged red lines. His mouth twisted, eyes exaggerated with anger. The figure's hands were covered in what looked like red fire, not detailed blood, but the suggestion of violence. The second drawing was softer, the courtroom sketched from memory. Shadow sat beside a stick figure boy, and the judge loomed behind her desk with tall posture and kind, wide eyes. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the drawings. "Leo, did you make these today?" she asked carefully, not wanting to push. Leo nodded, eyes still focused on the second sketch, the one that didn't hurt to look at. Shadow nudged his hand and Leo instinctively placed his small palm on the dog's head. "Can I show these to the court?" Rachel asked. Another nod. That was all the permission she needed. As the court resumed session and the judge re-entered, Rachel approached the bench and requested to submit the drawings into evidence. This time she didn't narrate what Leo had created. She let the visuals speak for themselves. When the judge held them up and the jury leaned forward, it was as if the air shifted again. Rachel stood silently for a beat before stepping back and kneeling beside Leo at the front bench. "If you want to say anything, now would be okay," she said gently. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. Not at first. His eyes wandered. Not to Rachel, not to the judge, not even to Shadow. They locked onto Elmore. That's when Leo whispered. I saw his eyes. They were mad. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with something alive, electric. It was the sound of 25 adults all realizing that what they had dismissed, a child's scrawl, a frightened murmur, a therapy dog, was actually the clearest voice in the room. "Did you hear what he said?" Judge Holloway asked softly, confirming the record. The court reporter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Rachel looked toward the jury. Not one of them seemed skeptical anymore. The older man in seat 4, who had barely reacted to the earlier testimonies, had tears in his eyes. The retired teacher on the panel wiped her glasses, her jaw tight with emotion. They weren't just listening to Leo now, they were feeling him. The defense shifted uncomfortably and Elmore paled, his fingers twitching against the table. His co-counsel tried to whisper something to him, but he brushed her off. His confidence, the smug demeanor, the courtroom swagger was gone. Leo wasn't attacking him. He wasn't even accusing him with words. He was remembering in front of 12 strangers what fear looked like, what evil felt like, and he was doing it with a coloring pencil and the bravery of someone who had already survived it once. The judge requested a short recess, but no one moved. Even the silence seemed unwilling to let go of the moment. Rachel leaned close to Leo. "Do you know what you just did?" she asked. He didn't answer, but she saw it. The subtle shift in his posture. Not pride, not confidence. Something deeper. Relief. Like a knot had loosened in his chest, and for the first time he could breathe without carrying the full weight of the memory alone. Shadow licked the back of Leo's hand once and laid down beside him again, ever vigilant. Rachel turned to Dr. Fields, who whispered, "This is more than evidence. This is catharsis. For him, for everyone." And it was true. There was no precedent for what they were watching. A trial that was never supposed to be about a child had become entirely centered on one, not through spectacle, but through quiet, undeniable truth. Rachel looked again at the drawings. one a wound, the other a wish. Together they painted a story that no adult could have crafted more powerfully. As court resumed, Rachel readdressed the jury. You've heard from experts, you've reviewed reports, you've seen footage, but what you saw today, that was not a performance. That was a child's truth. No embellishment, no manipulation. Just memory, the way a child holds it. She held up the drawing of Elmore, jagged and terrifying, and let it sit in front of the jury. He didn't draw a monster because he was told to. He drew what scared him. And then he drew this. She held up the courtroom scene, peaceful, with shadow, with kindness. This is where he feels safe. That tells you everything. Her words didn't rise in pitch. She didn't dramatize because she didn't need to. The room was already gripped, not by theatrics, but by authenticity. For the first time, Leo's testimony wasn't filtered through adult translations or legal structure. It was direct, human, and terrifyingly pure, and it shook the courtroom in a way nothing else could. Leo looked directly at the jury and said softly, I saw his eyes. They were mad. Elmore, pale and shaking, began to unravel under pressure. The jury wasn't just hearing Leo anymore. They were feeling him. His fear, his courage, his truth. When the courtroom quieted after Leo's testimony, the next question posed by Rachel wasn't for evidence. It was for understanding. She knelt beside him, microphone angled subtly away to give him privacy, and asked in a whisper only partly picked up by the court recorder, Leo, how do you remember so much? There was a pause. His little hand gripped a fistful of fur, his fingers twisting through Shadow's neck as though anchoring himself to something invisible. Then he leaned in closer to the dog's ear and murmured a reply that felt heavier than anything spoken on record so far. Because Shadow remembers with me. That was all, but those 5 words traveled through the courtroom like a stone across water. Ripples of stunned silence, shifting glances, the quiet breaking of something internal. The jury, once distant and analytical, now sat differently, their expressions no longer neutral. They weren't watching a case unfold. They were witnessing a child rebuild trust, not with people, but with a creature who had asked nothing of him, judged nothing in him, and simply stayed. Rachel stood slowly, clearing her throat, visibly holding back the emotions swelling in her chest. Let the record reflect, she said, her voice steady. The witness responded, because Shadow remembers with me. The judge gave a nod but said nothing. His gaze resting on Leo was something more than judicial detachment, a softness that rarely passed the bench. No cross-examination followed. The defense had no questions, no rebuttal, nothing to say. What could be said in the face of such unfiltered truth? Elmore didn't even lift his eyes. He simply shifted in his seat, hands clenched beneath the table. Meanwhile, Shadow, ever calm, rested his head on Leo's foot, blinking slowly, his breathing synced with the boy's. They were one body in that moment, child and dog, survivor and witness, heartbeat to heartbeat. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, not theatrical, reverent. For the first time in this courtroom, no one was trying to interpret Leo's trauma through adult frameworks or legal tactics. They were simply listening to what was said and to what wasn't. During the lunch recess, Judge Holloway remained seated while the rest of the courtroom cleared. Rachel hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but the judge motioned her forward. Counselor, he began, his tone more human than official, would you remain for a moment? She nodded, glancing back at Leo and Shadow seated quietly with Dr. Fields in the gallery. The judge exhaled deeply. I've presided over more trials than I care to count, but I've never seen anything like this. He paused, tapping a finger lightly on the bench. I read the statutes this morning. There's precedent for child advocacy aides, support personnel, but nothing quite like Shadow. Rachel's brows lifted. Are you saying? He held up a hand. I'm saying I believe this court needs to evolve with what's real. That boy trusts no one but that dog. And yet he's giving us more truth than half the witnesses who've taken that stand. Rachel swallowed hard, realizing what he was about to say would be remembered long after this case closed. I'm granting Shadow the designation of official communication aide, effective immediately. His presence is no longer supportive, it's evidentiary. That dog is part of this boy's memory. Rachel blinked, speechless for a second. Your Honor, Thank you. Truly. He nodded, but his expression grew serious. This isn't a gesture, Miss Torres. This is recognition. You and I both know what trauma does to memory. But that boy? He's remembering with help. And if the system can't adapt to that, then we're part of the problem, she nodded, emotion climbing up her throat like static. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about justice keeping pace with healing, not in theory, but in practice. That afternoon, in a brief but deeply symbolic ceremony held in the judge's chambers, Holloway signed a formal document, an addendum to the court procedure, granting Shadow official status. The badge was small, a novelty more than anything, clipped to the dog's vest, but its meaning was seismic. Leo didn't say much when they handed Shadow the badge. He simply placed his hand on the vest, right over it, and smiled for the first time in court. Not a grin, not a beam, just the soft kind of smile that comes when fear steps back, even just for a moment. Word of the designation spread quickly through the courthouse. Officers, clerks, and legal aides whispered about it in hallways. Some were surprised, others relieved, many deeply moved. Dr. Fields later told Rachel that the badge wasn't just for Shadow, it was for Leo too. That badge, he said, tells Leo that what he remembers matters, that he matters, and indeed it became more than a title. It became a bridge between child and justice, memory and meaning. Leo began to carry himself a little differently. It's not louder, not more confident, but steadier. When someone tried to speak to him directly now, he didn't recoil. He'd glance at Shadow first, then sometimes nod. Not always, but enough. The system was learning to move at his pace, speak in his language. Rachel watched it happen day by day, and she understood. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that healing had a place in the courtroom, and that sometimes the smallest voices, paired with the softest pause, carried the loudest truths. When asked again how he remembered so much, Leo only whispered, "Because Shadow remembers with me." The jury wasn't just witnessing evidence, they were witnessing the birth of trust in a child once thought unreachable. Shadow had become more than comfort. He had become Leo's voice, memory, and shield. In a quiet ceremony during a lunch recess, Judge Holloway, visibly moved, granted Shadow the status of official communication aide, unprecedented in that court's history. No longer just a dog in a vest, Shadow had become a bridge between pain and justice. On the final day of testimony, as the courtroom stirred with the slow morning shuffle of movement and expectation, no one expected what happened next. Without a cue, a call, or the gentle encouragement he usually required, Leo stood. For a moment, people didn't notice, not until the small figure stepped past his foster mother's knee, Shadow rising beside him in synchrony. The murmur of the gallery died as Leo tightened his grip on the dog's leash and walked forward. Something gripped tightly in his other hand, paper, folded and colorful. He didn't stop to look for permission. He didn't glance back. He reached the stand, climbed the little step stool that had been quietly kept for him, and faced the front of the room. Then, turning his wide eyes to the judge, not Rachel, not the prosecutor or therapist or any familiar face, he spoke. "He won't hurt Mommy again, right?" The room fell absolutely still, not still like shock, still like reverence. A question asked not with fear, but with fragile hope, the kind of hope that dares to breathe only after too many days of holding its breath. Judge Holloway's throat worked around words that didn't come immediately. Her fingers fumbled briefly with her glasses before she placed them aside entirely, leaning forward so Leo could see her eyes without the reflection. She didn't look like a judge in that moment. She looked like a human being trying not to cry. "No, Leo," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with conviction. "He won't. Ever again." That answer, not rehearsed, not filtered through legal jargon, hung in the air like an oath. Leo nodded once. He didn't smile, but his shoulders loosened. That subtle shift in posture, in breath, in presence, it said more than any adult testimony given in all the days prior. He believed her, not because she wore a robe or held power, but because she answered him the way people answer children when they know the truth matters more than protocol. From the jury box, a woman covered her mouth to stifle a sob. One of the male jurors pinched the bridge of his nose, blinking hard. Even the stenographer had to pause, fingers hovering over her keys. Leo didn't leave the stand right away. Instead, he unfolded the drawing he had brought. It was different from all the others. There were no jagged lines, no angry colors, no red scribbles over fists or broken tables. This one was soft, gentle in its detail. A house with windows. A little garden with flowers. A woman with long brown hair standing by a door, her smile drawn with a single curved line. Next to her was a boy, holding the paw of a dog whose vest was unmistakable, even in crayon. Leo placed the drawing gently on the small table beside him, looked at Rachel, then at the judge again, and said nothing else. He didn't need to. It was a statement as clear as any affidavit. This is the future I want. This is the life I hope for. Shadow sat beside him, tail softly brushing the floor, head slightly tilted as if sensing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Dr. Fields, standing quietly at the back, whispered to himself, "He's choosing what comes next." Rachel couldn't find words fast enough. Her throat was tight, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the bench to formally submit the drawing into evidence. But this time, no legal terminology came from her mouth. Instead, she simply said, "Exhibit ... hope." The judge allowed it without question. No objections came from the defense. Elmore, once so composed, sat slumped in his seat, defeated, eyes fixed on the boy he had underestimated. Rachel returned to her seat, glancing briefly at Leo, and gave him the faintest nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was respect, the kind that recognizes courage when it stands without armor. This wasn't about a verdict anymore. The room understood that. This was about a boy who'd carried unspeakable pain, finally finding a way to set it down, not with revenge, but with clarity and color. The final minutes of the session passed with none of the usual legal theater. No further testimony was needed. The silence had done its work. But this time, the silence didn't feel oppressive or heavy. It felt earned, like peace returning after a long siege. The gavel didn't strike. The judge didn't dismiss the court right away. She simply leaned back, hand over her mouth, eyes glistening, and let the moment breathe. Leo stepped down with Shadow close at his heel. As they walked back to their seats, the jury's eyes followed them, not as spectators of a legal drama, but as witnesses to something deeply human, a healing, a promise made and believed. A little boy walking away from the stand, holding onto a leash in a dream. On the final day of testimony, Leo surprised everyone. For the first time, he walked to the stand without being prompted, holding a drawing in one hand and Shadow's leash in the other. He climbed onto the witness chair and said to the judge, "He won't hurt Mommy again, right?" The room held its breath. The drawing he brought was different, colorful, hopeful. A home, a garden, a woman with a smile, a boy holding a dog's paw. The judge, with a soft tremble in her voice, answered, "No, Leo, he won't." The silence that once bound him had finally broken. Weeks had passed since the verdict, but the weight of it and what led to it still lived in the soft spaces of everyone it had touched. On a quiet Thursday morning, in a private office at the County Child Services Department, Leo was officially placed into the custody of his maternal aunt, Maria Delgado. The moment wasn't grand or filled with press or applause. It wasn't meant to be. Instead, it was quiet, sacred in its simplicity. Maria knelt beside Leo, whispering gently in Spanish, words soft with love and permanence. She wasn't just accepting a child. She was receiving a history marked by silence, fear, and now, possibility. Rachel stood nearby, her usual legal pad absent, her hands folded before her, watching as Leo pressed his cheek briefly into his aunt's shoulder. Didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The way his small fingers clung to her shirt, the way his body leaned into hers without flinching, it spoke of trust earned, not demanded. Shadow lay curled beside them, tail flicking once when Leo glanced his way. He had followed Leo through a courtroom of fire, and now he followed him home. After the signatures were finalized and hands were shaken, Rachel turned to leave, not wanting to make the moment about herself. But before she could step away, Leo walked toward her, clutching something in his hand, a piece of folded paper. "For you," he said, and it was the first time he had spoken to her directly. Rachel crouched slowly, taking the offering with reverence. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered, unsure if her voice would hold. She unfolded the paper, careful not to crease it further. Inside was a drawing, bold and uneven, lines too thick in some places and too faint in others, but undeniably clear in what it meant. There were 3 figures beneath a wide, uneven sky. One was her in a blazer and skirt, smiling in crayon yellow. One was Leo, his curls scribbled in brown, a stick figure with a hand raised. The third, of course, was Shadow, his vest unmistakable. Above them, drawn in big capital letters across the child's version of clouds and sun, was one word: family. Rachel couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was from the kind of awe that comes only a few times in life, when you realize that everything you thought was about winning a case had, in truth, been about saving a soul. She looked at Leo, and he looked right back. Not past her, not through her, but at her. That alone undid something in her that had been locked away since her own childhood. Her fingers brushed over the drawing again, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to cry. Not out of sadness, but because healing, she realized, didn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It grew in quiet things. A whispered thank you. A drawing. a child's gaze no longer afraid to meet your own. "You're brave," she managed, smiling through the tears. Leo only nodded, eyes bright. "Shadow says you are too," he said, and for that, Rachel had no answer, only the truth of it echoing inside her chest. Shadow, now officially semi-retired, would no longer patrol hospitals or courtrooms. His days of duty had shifted into days of play. He would chase balls in Maria's backyard, nap beside Leo during story time, and still walk with that unmistakable awareness that he had done something important. Heroism doesn't always look like headlines. Sometimes it looks like a dog lying in the grass while a boy ties a red cape around his neck made from an old towel. Rachel stayed a little longer than she planned, sitting on the porch steps while Maria made lemonade inside. Leo joined her without a word, simply resting his head against her arm. Rachel didn't speak either. There was nothing left to prove, no case to argue, no sentence to prepare. There was only presence. And that, at last, was enough. The trial had ended, and the verdict had been delivered with the full force of the law, but what endured beyond the gavel's echo was something deeper. Healing. Not wrapped in press conferences or legal citations, but in the small human ways people mend after breaking. Rachel would go back to her office, to her long hours and tireless casework, but something in her had shifted permanently. And she would look at each future case differently now, not just with the lens of justice, but with the compassion to pause, to listen for silences, to notice the child clinging to a stuffed bear in the hallway. Because of Leo, because of Shadow, because healing had a name now. And sometimes it was written in crayon. Weeks later, Leo was formally placed in the custody of his aunt, a safe home full of sunlight and warmth. Rachel attended the small ceremony, and before leaving, Leo handed her a folded piece of paper. Inside, a crayon drawing of Rachel, Shadow, and himself beneath a sky that read in big, bold letters, "Family." Shadow, now semi-retired, stayed close, his days of service transformed into days of play. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, but what remained was far more powerful than punishment: healing. For Leo, for Rachel, for a courtroom that had finally listened. And in that space between trauma and truth, a new family had quietly been born. We've poured our hearts into creating this story for you, and every detail was chosen with care so it could truly resonate. If this video touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What lesson or feeling did it bring to you? Share it with us in the comments. Your stories and reflections mean so much to our community. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription helps us continue bringing more heartfelt stories like this one, crafted especially for you. Take a moment to explore our other videos too. You might find another story that speaks to your heart. Thank you for being here with us. Your support is what makes this journey possible.